Welcome, everybody. I'm Rami Khouri with the Social Justice Program here at IFI, and we are happy to host this lecture, and we thank you all for coming. This is a talk by Professor Zafiris Tzannatos, which is about a new social contract for the Arab world, which he will explain to us why we need a new social contract, and looking back on the conditions that led up to the uprisings and trends since then, and disparities and inequalities and many different things that relate to the political economy and the conditions in this region, the trends, and how citizens react to these things. And maybe he'll give us some suggestions about what we can do to perhaps not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Now, given the recent history of Greece, and he being Greek, one is cautious about taking advice on economics from Greeks, given the way they had their country. But in this case, we make an exception because he has a very distinguished career. He was actually the former chair of the economics department at AUB, and he's held senior academic and research appointments in Europe, as well as leadership and managerial posts with international organizations, with the World Bank and the ILO and others, and as well as advisory positions with some Arab governments. And he is now a fellow at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies here in Beirut. So with that short introduction, I will turn it over to him, and thank you all for coming.
Many thanks, Rami. Always pleasure to return back to AUB, and especially to Issam Fares, which is the new kid on the block, I think. It doesn't go back to the 19th century. Okay. I'm particularly pleased, in the middle of the summer to have such an audience whose average age is about a third of mine. And that's from where one gets the news and also candid advice. Talking to the older ones, it's not always that exciting. So I'll start with that. It's a kind of an idea in the making that I have, and a little bit journalistic if you want. So I flooded it with all these references to make it a little bit more academic and sound a little bit more reputable. I'll take you through a couple of them. One is the number one, if you can read what it is, by Hedba Handusa and myself, and that was effectively the first snapshot of social protection and labor markets in the MENA region. Snapshot means that we took what is the labor situation and unemployment, that everybody cares, where do benefits come in, social assistance, pensions, and so on. So it provides a good snapshot of where we were in the late 1990s. The second reference, I only want you to notice the date, which is 2009. It's a piece I wrote about the previous crisis that was around, the global financial and economic crisis in 2008, that you are all familiar with. The rest is simply references, and I will then go down to the important ones are 12, 13, 14. Which are from the World Bank, a very recent publication on the topic that Rami asked me to talk, inequality and uprisings and what we know about it. And then, some kind of views on what the social contract should look like and how we can have more poverty reduction in the Arab states. So the outline is what is the Arab world? And one of my theses is, I will not expand very much on that, is it is neither homogeneous nor unique. And wherever I go, I hear, oh, we are different. No, in terms of what I look at, which is economics, employment, and social policy, I cannot see anything different among the Arab people, either in the economic part or in the social including even the religious part, which is part of the social, and people may kind of look at the Middle East and the Arab world in an Islamic kind of way, but they miss the changes that are happening, which are happening very quickly. I provide a little bit of context and what has happened with respect to numbers, if you want, growth and inequality in the Arab world. And then I will pick up on a particular kind of recent publication that the Arab Spring has been a puzzle. And in my view, it has not been a puzzle. Of course, it's very difficult to predict crisis, but at least some people have predicted it. And then we'll go through some numbers on the inequality and social impact, and where do we stand with respect to economic reforms and rationality, reducing the debt, the deficit, inflation, and vis-a-vis what has happened to the people. Because sometimes we end up in a situation where the numbers prosper and the people suffer. And this has been the case in the Middle East and North Africa, and what lies ahead. So this is just a very quick way, I will summarize it, that the Arab world is extremely heterogeneous. You have Lilliputian states of 200,000 and 300,000 from Qatar to Comoros, the GCC and others. You have some that are the richest in the world and some that are the poorest. Because when we refer to the Arab countries, I think we have to take stock of what's happening in Mauritania, in Sudan, in Djibouti. There are also Arab countries. Libya is one that we do not have data, but we shouldn't forget that it is also there. So first, it is heterogeneous, and second, the way we measure it, and international organizations measure it, is a little bit bogus. For example, we include Iran in the Arab region. Now, Iran is 46% of the Middle East population. If you take Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and Iran, if you put Iran there, effectively half of the average that you calculate, you describe Iran. And it's a little bit different than the Arab region. So one thing is, do we concentrate on the Arab region or some kind of geographical, we have a geographical approach. Some people even include Turkey in the analysis of the region. And in fact, those who in the 2011 were praising Turkey, how it can have secular and democracy kind of regime, along with being Muslim country, you can see what happened there. Somehow there is an Orientalism in the approach we have in analyzing the region, in the sense we see it very much from the eyes of the Western or advanced countries. And this is something I already mentioned, that the region is not homogeneous and has many more peculiarities than the way we aggregate the region. Another thing that perhaps very few have noticed, and so far as I know I'm the only one who's doing it, is I use straight country averages instead of population-weighted averages. What does this mean? I'm interested in explaining country performance. If you use population-weighted averages, you take the whole region, all the Arabs, 300 million, and you find what the average Arab does. This doesn't mean anything to me. I want to find what the average Arab country is doing. And just as an example, if you take growth after 2010, the growth in the non-oil producing countries, Arab countries, has been 0.8 of 1%. If you exclude Egypt, it has been 2.9, almost 3 times higher. So if you do a population-weighted average of the Arab world, given that Egypt has all these millions against the other smaller states, then effectively your average describes Egypt. And of course, Egypt has the better statistics and available statistics. So you don't usually have data on 22 Arab countries. You have usually data on Jordan, Lebanon very rarely, Syria does not have any, Libya does not have any, Sub-Saharan Africa does not have any. So you end up with 5, 6 countries, and you take population-weighted averages, of which one country is Egypt. So effectively, you are describing Egypt. You go to the Gulf. How much is women's labor force participation in the GCC? If you use population-weighted averages, it's 13%. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is the biggest one, where no women work. If you use country averages, then you end up with 26%, double. So these are something I say so that we have a better grasp of what the data that I have mean. Finally, and this is important, for the topic we have here, look how heterogeneous politically, at least the way citizens see the situation, how heterogeneous the political situation is in the Arab world. You have countries, at least 1 in 5, which does not seem very high actually, think that democracy is very appropriate. I think what is important, what is not said here, that 80% do not think it's completely appropriate. But anyway, those who think that it is completely appropriate, I mean, ranges from up to 20%. And then you have others, not surprisingly, Egypt, that they don't think democracy is appropriate. And also look, I mean, at this aggregation, the Maghreb versus the Mazrek. You see in the Maghreb, more people think democracy is appropriate compared to the Mazrek. In fact, of all the distinctions that I have come across of Arab countries, oil producing, non-oil producing, water rich, or whatever it is, I think the geographical separation is a very important one for analysis. The countries of the Euromed, the Arab countries of the Med, which are part of the Euromed, are much more integrated, if you want, globally, and much more modern institutionally than the countries that are the Middle East or in the Gulf. Now, on the uniqueness, let me say this as another introduction. And this is from the Brexit. And these are 2 quotations. One is from The Guardian and the other is from America. And what it says, the first one, is that we've been monitoring the situation on the Brexit from purely income growth, and we missed what was happening in terms of standards of living, of housing financing, and so on. And at the end, despite the progress that we had, that the low-income and middle-income households have been very much left behind. This is very important. People do not benchmark themselves only on the income they receive. I may have a very high income, but if Rami has higher, I'm still not satisfied. So people go by that. And this is something that came out after the Brexit, where the less educated and the less poor somehow, they felt that they were left behind, and they were actually. The second one is very interesting because in the Arab world, the uprisings raised the question, was it a failure of economic reforms or political reforms? And as I will argue, the two have to go together. So we were monitoring, those who think it is a puzzle, they were monitoring the economic effects, but they forgot the political one. And what the second quotation from the Bank of America says is that we are dealing with a country that had no economic or financial crisis, and yet they took the opportunity of the referendum to express their political discontent. So what was going on? And this is where there is no uniqueness of the Arab world. The Arab world in the last 20 years has been deflationary and unequal. This is exactly the same thing. Growth has not been fast, and growth has been very unequal. People were left behind. So, in terms of short history, the 1980s was a lost decade. It was from the 50s and 60s, independence, call it, I don't know, Nasserism or Arab socialism. That model, which I called, and everybody called, the old social model that we need to change, social contract that we need to change, reached its limits. It was paternalistic, state-driven industrialization. In Egypt, they even reached the point where once you got a degree, you were entitled to a civil service job. I mean, you can imagine what this means, especially in Lebanon. You get degrees, and what entitlement do you have? Unless you get on a plane, you go to Dubai or elsewhere, it's very difficult to find a job. And this, of course, led to a lot of fiscal deficit because you were hiring people that you do not need, led to underperformance of the public sector, and led to underinvestment in education. Because I wouldn't go and get a difficult degree, I'll get an easy degree, and with that piece of paper, I had an entitlement. So, 1980s, we reached the limits of that model, and there were significant economic reforms, starting in 1989, surprise, surprise, where? In Tunisia, the poster child of economic reforms, which is exactly where the uprisings started. What I will say is that the reforms, however, they are not as glorious as they were advertised at the time by the IFIs, which is the International Financial Institutions, another IFI, the World Bank and the IMF. By the way, I was on the World Bank. I'm very proud about that, and they have done a very good job in many respects, and especially in analysis, although I have something to say later on that. And I will say the reforms and economic measures were partially articulated, and I will explain to what this means. Then 2010-11, the uprising comes, and then everybody says, let's have a new social contract. And this is my point. The new social contract was, where is it? Mouse. The new social contract was this, and it blew up in 2010. So those now who say, let's have a new social contract, if you read what they write, very skillfully, they go back and criticize that contract. Oh, it should not be the public sector. We should not go back to that model, but we should continue the reforms that we had that also failed. Thank you. Yeah. So the new social contract here, as you will see, is people refer to that. It's a slip of tongue or a deliberate, if you want, use of language. Anyway, let me give a little bit more substance on what I'm saying. I will give two figurative examples of partial articulation, which can be considered economics, actually. One is this one. I mean, you've seen how, what they call them paleontologists, they find a bone here, a bone there, and they produce that. That's what we do in economics and in economic reforms. We say, if you privatize, and if you liberalize, and if you open up the banks, and if you roll back the state, you will end up with an ideal economy. So this is called partial articulation in physics, and I think we can apply it very well in what we are discussing today. The economic reforms of the 1990s were partially articulated. Look how nice that is. You find the skeleton, and you can even say the eye is red, or that it had a beard underneath. So it's exactly this kind of problems that we're facing in economics. The problem is we're not dealing with fossils, we're dealing with living creatures. So what did they do? These are the elements of the bones. They said, let's liberalize trade. Let's deregulate the financial markets. I don't know about the first, but the second we know from 2008, it was a catastrophic prescription. Let's privatize. Eventually what happened, it was not privatization, it was denationalization, where the money went to the sons of Mubarak and the wife of Ben Ali. And I don't know about Syria and Yemen were the other stories. And then we had fiscal consolidation. And I will be the first as an economist to say, yes, you need fiscal consolidation, not to spend more than you earn. But it makes a lot of difference what you cut, by how much, and who is affected. Fiscal consolidation does not mean like in my country. Specifically, I can give you an example. My mother is 92 years old, and she had a disability pension. And because of the need of fiscal consolidation, she was asked to present herself to the medical committee, which she did, and she was declared fit at the age of 92. Right? So there are fiscal consolidation, there's fiscal consolidation and fiscal consolidation. What happened here was an uncritical rollback of the state. And I remember I was coming to the region in the 1990s. There was no private education, for example, in Jordan at the time, right? Had a very good public system. Today, unless you send your kids to the private schools, I mean, you think you are not doing very well, and in fact, you are not. However, it achieved a lot. These partially articulated reforms, in fairness, did what we economists care for, to reduce the debt, the deficit, and inflation. These are I do not challenge them at all. The issue is how you do it and whether you have what UNICEF was saying, adjustment with the human face. So did this matter, the debt, deficit, and the inflation for the citizens? I mean, this is the question. Going back a little bit on the history, you can see how well we were doing in the 1970s. That was the price of oil. And by the mid-1980s, the Arab region, no matter whether it had oil or non-oil, it has reverted, if you want, to the global average. And since then, it's the lost decade, and things were not moving very fast either. Then, in 2000, we had growth. in per capita income in the Arab world. This is the growth in per capita income. So in East Asia Pacific, in 2000 somebody had $100. In 2010 had $219. In the Middle East, if you had $100, you had 130. So for us economists, looking at, look, you had 2 lost decades and you didn't have any growth, now you have 30%, it's not bad. So we were blinded, if you want, a little bit by that. At the same time, let's go back to what I said before. At the end of the day, in a globalized world, I know that I got 30%, but all other regions are getting more. So the material wealth of the other regions is a little bit a comparison between East Germany and West Germany. Yes, East Germany, they were not starving in 1989, but they could see what US Germany was producing vis-a-vis East Germany. And there are many such comparisons. So, this is the puzzle. This is, unfortunately, I don't like to pick up on specifically on things, but this is the latest publication from the World Bank, and it is exactly the title we are discussing today, Inequality, Uprisings, and Conflict. And it starts with the Middle East and North Africa is a puzzle. Why? Because we eliminated extreme poverty, and compared to the average incomes, the poor have not done well. So, what is the extreme poverty here? The extreme poverty went down from 4.7 to 1.7. Let me ask you the question. If the 4.7 had gone to 9, would there be a revolution? The most destituted 3-4% would have done a revolution. We know the revolutions don't come from the poorest. They are too busy. I mean, poverty keeps you busy a lot. The revolutions come a little bit later from the middle class and the educated. So I would say this is an irrelevant statistic to start with. Second, when you examine the total incomes, even if the poor have done well, it is possible that the 1% has done even better. What's the point? The middle class has been suffering. And this is what the data show, that the middle class has collapsed. Why? Because they lost the free education. I don't have to have higher wages, but if I have free education for the children, I save a lot. They lost the free health care. They lost the benefits. They lost the pensions. So what the middle class suffered was a very slow increase in incomes, if at all, and increase in security. And at the end of the day, security is more valuable than income. If you know that income is 100, you have 100 or 200. But within security, you can go to 0. And this matters much more than anything else. So is this a puzzle that nobody saw it coming? Well, somebody said in 2009, after the financial crisis, another risk of the crisis may be the creation of social tensions, which were already there. And the risk may be higher when governments in the region pursue economic liberalization. I'm too modest to say who wrote it, but if you remember, I had a reference in 2009. So you can go and see there who said that one. So it was not that much of a surprise. Another assessment from something I already wrote in 2012, but it was based on Mustafa Nali, who's the chief economist of the World Bank. And if you remember, the previous publication was also World Bank. Is it true the absolute poverty declined in the Arab region between 1981 and 2005? And this is poverty at $2 per day, not the $1 per day that was used before, and it was only 2%. Not as much as the other regions, but anyway, there was a decline. But as I said, this group does not determine outcomes, like the Brexit. The Brexit was determined by the middle class. It was not the poorest, it was not the richest. It's the middle class that makes the political economy. Second, against the statistics we had before, you can see this one is the difference between the richest and the poorest, and has increased in Egypt, in Jordan, in Morocco, in Syria, and Tunisia. It only declined in Algeria, partly because of the oil that was going on. And Gini coefficient here is a measure of inequality. It increased in all countries. So you see the data here that we were seeing both increasing inequality, both increasing distance between the poorest and the richest. So it is not a puzzle anymore. Now let's go to Another regional assessment by Khaled Abu Ismail, who is working in Espoir, and he says very rightly, the choice of poverty measure is very important, and by working on the middle class instead of the poorest, he finds that the middle class actually was losing ground. And when it comes to inequality, in fact, he also estimates that there has been a rise in inequality. I think you're all familiar with Piketty. He was here about a month ago. And as he has found that the top 1% in the MENA region gets 25% of all the region's income. It is a bit unweighted here. The income includes the Gulf, but nevertheless, the point is we have a lot of inequality in the region. Finally, if you remember, the case by the... Okay. If you remember the case of Egypt before, in the puzzle that it was mentioned in the World Bank publication, was made with reference to the very poor, the $1 a day effectively, that went down to 1.7%. These are national data, and I think national indices are more relevant than international data because they reflect the country condition. And look what happened in Egypt even before the uprisings, up and from 1999 to 2010. Within a period of 10 years, poverty rates 16% to 25%. That was a big change. It is a big change to have 25% of your people considered by national standards to be poor. My mother, by national standards, is not poor. By international standards, she's not poor, but she became poorer, after the benefit was cut. So, why do I say that? The most important part in any economy is employment. If I give you money, you have independence, you have your dignity, you don't want to know anything about benefits and whether the government will give you public job or whatever. And I'll come back to that later on. So let's see now what happened to the social sectors, to employment, security, and benefits and the like. Look at this one. This is 2015 June with reference to President Sisi. 9 out of 10 Egyptians approve him. If you remember, in the previous slide, Egypt had the least appreciation for democracy, right? Which fits very well here. 9 out of 10 Egyptians approve the performance of the presidents. Go back to the second bullet, creating job opportunities, half of them self that they didn't deliver. And what is important is the third. People do not want to go back to the old social contract that we are fighting now as a ghost. We need a new social contract against the paternalism and Nasserism and social Arab socialism. People don't want to have a standard of living. No, I don't want the government to give me benefits. I don't want dependency. Give me a job. Give me a decent job. And this is enough. I can then manage myself. Okay, let's go a little bit quickly now on this storyline. The Arab region has the highest inequality of education opportunity. People say the quality is not good of education and the like, that's fine. But here what we see is we have a huge gap if you are born poor or rich. So this creates tremendous dynamics with respect to the 1% at the top, the middle class and the poor. What do we have here? Here we have that, this is the per capita income of countries, and this is the percentage of people in agriculture. This line here is how you will see employment in agriculture to decline as you become richer. In the States, only 2%, I think, of the labor force is in agriculture. In Europe, it's 3% because they have a little bit more protection. But if you see, all Arab countries have a disproportionate percentage of workers in agriculture, except Lebanon. What it means is if you are young and you want to come to the labor market, you have much higher chances of being there rather than being in the modern sector of the economy. And in fact, if you find jobs, it's most likely to be in the informal sector. Algeria had the most spectacular decline in unemployment during this period, before the Arab uprisings. Look at the decline in unemployment. It was phenomenal, from 30% down to 10%. That's phenomenal in 10 years. But then look, there was an equal increase effectively into the informal employment, into agriculture and jobs without contracts. So these people were not seeing anything better over time, which is back what we were saying, the indicator that you use for progress. Another thing for the, which is characteristic of the region. Here is East Europe, and this is Latin America. These are the poorest group, and this is the richest group. Unemployment in the richest group within that country is that low compared to that high among the poorest. The same for Latin America. If you are poor, you have high unemployment rate. This is the next income group, the next, this is the richest, you go down. In the Middle East and North Africa, as you can see, no matter whether you're poor or rich, your chances of being unemployed have been high. I mean, you get the point here that we were, that there were no jobs opportunities, and we'll see it very clearly in a minute later on when I talk about wages. Not only you can find employment that is decent, but look here at the rate of social protection across the different regions in the world. The silver is the Middle East and North Africa across all aspects of social protection in terms of disability, injury, maternity, old age, survivor benefits, unemployment, and family allowances. So despite all the renaissance that we had and the hype that we were doing well in the Arab region, you can see you were losing both on employment and also on benefits. At the end of the day, that's where the cookie crumbles. We produce as a country, we produce 100. How much do workers get? With globalization, in all countries, in all regions, the workers get less. Who gets more? Usually the financial people, who are 1% of the labor force and take 15 to 20% of total kind of profits in the economy. And you can see in all regions, in Europe, in Asia and Pacific, in Eastern Europe, North America, in Africa and Latin America, the share of GDP, what we all produce, has gone down. But look at the collapse here of the Middle East and North Africa. And it's not, So they lost 25%, the workers. Now, what happened to household consumption? It's exactly 25% also. Again, in most regions, household consumption has declined. That is what is there for the people to consume, not investments and not savings and not other things that the rich are doing, but consumption by households. So you didn't have a job, you didn't have wages, and your consumption has declined. Is it a puzzle? I don't think it is a puzzle. Here shows something else, another dimension, which is compared to the incomes we have in the Arab world, how does social development do? And it's only 3 countries that are doing better, Tunisia, Jordan, and Palestine. The social indicators in terms of health and education and other things are ahead of their income, if you were of welfareism, only these 3 countries. The other countries have become very rich, but it hasn't trickled down to the masses. So their social development is lower than their economic development. Okay, and now, these are things that we all know. How was the world, the citizens, looking at their prospects in 2006 and 2010? Okay? In all regions, this is pessimism, okay? In all regions, pessimism declined. It was a good decade, actually, until the financial crisis, right? In all regions, the pessimism declined, but in the Middle East, it was increasing. Not surprisingly, if one were to look at the data that I have been showing you.
Where is this from?
Gallup. Yeah. It is in the ILO UNDP report that I've done with Mary and here in Beirut. It is in the references. Not 2001, 2009, 2012. And not only that, it was not just Gallup and opinions. These are the rate of protests in North Africa from 96 until the explosion happened. What you see is there was a protest in 1996, and it was controlled. And then it was controlled. And then it was controlled, and we come to 2010, December, and then 2011. What is interesting is when they were coming back after they were suppressed, the protests, they were coming back at a higher level. So you can control them once, you can control them twice, you can control them 3 times. Eventually, it blew up, as in 2010. So the punchline is that the region lost out a big time, both in economics and politics. It was both bad economics, partially articulated, and it was bad politics. It was non-democratic authoritarian regimes that cannot go much more in an era when everybody has a smartphone. So what does this diagram show? This says how much freedom you have politically. These are indices of voice. We can, as a citizen, you can complain, and whether the government will respond. It's the Kaufman index. And this is how fast your economy grows, okay? And you can see China there. They don't have democracy, but they are performing, at least during this period before the uprisings, the 10 years before, they had a stellar performance. This is India. India is the biggest democracy. If you believe this country of 1 billion, developing country, never had a dictatorship, is a phenomenal achievement. And then, of course, you have these countries that they have very high democracy but no growth. And can you say that democracy does not create growth? No. If you look at the countries, Sweden, Finland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, these countries had very high growth in the past. If they were to continue with that very high growth, now they will be in the moon. So once you reach $30,000 per capita, you can't grow much faster than that, okay? 1%, Europe is growing at 1% or 2%, or the United States. And Brazil, in the good old times, or India or China, they grow that much. So you want to be here to have democracy and high growth. There is a little bit of a trade-off. But if you count these red dots here, there are exactly 22, as many as the Arab countries. So all Arab countries are in the wrong quadrant. You don't want to be there. Especially, you don't want to be to the left of this bar, which has Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Yemen. Okay, KSA is there. I mean, we'll see how it goes. But you can see how this very simple representation shows how bad was both the economics and then the politics at the time. Okay, where do we go from here? It's not very promising. This is the situation from 2010. You see, I mean, South Asia already is 30% higher. The middle income countries, which is very much the Arab countries, are already 20% more. Look where we are trailing here. Effectively, we're even less than what we have in 2010. So how shall we go about it and have a new social contract? Not this way. These are the country responses to the uprising in 2011-12. So when these autocrats saw the crowd in the street, right, they said, what do we do? Look at this. First, the public wages and the policemen and the army, right? And then let's increase public employment. That it was successfully reduced till 2010. The fiscal and the debt and the deficit was going down, and they negated that for the short-term benefit of postponing anything else. Let's increase the minimum wages. Now, all these things are happening when the economy is collapsing. But that's how they reacted. I mean, for me, the most mind-boggling of this is pensions. Why do you appease the pensioners? Right? They already have a pension. Why do you increase the pension? My mother's pension was reduced. Pensions, why? Okay, these are the young minimum wages. You give them more. You pay unemployment benefits, right? You hire a few of them and the like. But why not? Why pensions, right? So that's not the way to go. This is another thing. I will not quote who said it. It was in this publication, What is the Social Contract and Why the Arab World Needs a New One. And the whole publication builds around this confession of one woman that said she was poor, and she was outside a private clinic in Cairo, and the author saw her and said, you are poor, why are you here in a private clinic? And the woman says, if I go to the public clinic, I lose the child if here in the private I will lose all my money. Okay? What is this? This is exactly the purpose, the point of my presentation. This person here is fighting the old social contract before 1980, which was public sector driven. There is one thing here, is it really the public sector, public hospitals are worse than the private, at least in some countries? And second, is this true this for Egypt? And guess what? The same day I read this publication, I read this one from Basira. Do you know this outfit in Cairo? It's a very famous, like Gallup, a local Gallup one. And they asked them, who provides better health services? 56% said the public sector, 20% the NGOs, 11% the private sector. This does not count. These are the don't knows and others. So the private sector is 11%. But this person, this analyst, is so blind that he said, no, if it's private, it has to be better. I remember the first private university in Britain. It was 1985. Up until then, they were all public. And the graffiti in the toilet was, this university is like a prostitute. You pay for if you can't go to Cambridge for free. So it's true we need more privatization, and we need to have more public-private synergies, but it is not true that we should go by that. If you read a lot of publications today, especially from the IFIs, they say that the public sector is corrupt, inefficient, there are teacher absenteeism, empty clinics, downsize and privatize, which are the economic reforms of the 1990s. And then you see the same organizations, and they have private sector surveys and investment climate assessments and the like, and they say the private sector is not private because it's captured by the state. So why not improve the public sector and privatize? Which I said at the beginning, it was denationalization. So we need a social contract, but let's reflect a little bit, especially economists. What kind of social contract should it be? Here is a taxonomy of people from right-wing, Hayek and Nozick and Buchanan, and then you go to the traditional social rights-based approach to social contract by law, and then well, I hope I will get some input from there, from professors of philosophy. I'm dilettante a little bit in this kind of things. But anyway, this is a nice taxonomy that says it's not so easy, social contract. Yes, we can agree, to do something, but which approach do we have? Thatcher had a social contract, right? But it was based on a libertarian approach. And then you go, okay, forget whatever you want to do. What are the things that you value? Is it the market? Is it the state? You want to empower or to provide security? You want it to have social democracy or neoliberalism? So it's not as simple as it sounds, and we cannot leave it there. Moreover, social what? It sounds so good because we like moralizing language. It's social, right? It's not authoritarian. We agree. We came together. It's transparent, it's legitimate, it's peaceful, consensual, or whatever you want to do. An issue that comes here is, do we want to have a social contract between the rulers and the citizens? And this is very much coming, if you want, from South Africa, the covenant and the reconciliation that happened with Mandela and after. And this has caught up, as a new thing by the World Economic Forum. And no matter whether you want to have it contract or covenant or what you want to call it, a social justice, how do you achieve it? Singapore is not a bad place to be, right? But it has effectively the same government since independence in the 1960s, and they are doing very well. So will it be on patronage or on citizens' rights? Will it be negative or positive? Would it be based on opportunities or on capacities? So you see, we can easily say we need something new, but what will it be? And will it be static for today? Will it be rotating? What the British referendum showed was something phenomenal, which built on the Greek referendum we are familiar in 2015. The socialist government that was the left government in Greece that was elected, had promised so much that was not feasible. So went to the people and say, they are asking us to do all these right-wing reforms. Do you want them, or shall we carry with the socialist agenda? 62% of people said, no, we want the socialist agenda. So the mandate by the people was 62-38. And guess what? That government did exactly what was not socialist at all, and not only took what the Troika, the lenders, wanted, and did all the neoliberal reforms, but it went even further than that because the situation had deteriorated so much, like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, that a 62% against was totally ignored in practice. Now we go to Brexit. The people said we want to exit, and 2/3 of parliament are against the Brexit. And there's a question there. Can the parliament, because the ultimate decision we found out rests with the parliament, not with the referendum. The referendum in Britain, we found out, is advisory. It shows what the people want to do, but the ones who make the decision is the parliament, right? So we are here, I mean, is it parliament that dictates? Is it a coalition? Is it the people? Anyway, I mean, these are many questions. I think I'm running out of time. So I think I'm going to the concluding remarks I had. No, it's more of a concluding questions. What is the social contract? Is it in the nation, the state, or the government? A big problem we have in Greece, and you have it in Lebanon, and practically all developing countries have. There is no difference between the government and the state. There I put Belgium. Why? Because Belgium, for 560 days, did not have a government, and nobody noticed. Why? Because the state was working. It's not for the government to have the rubbish collected, or to have hospitals, or to have public transport. This is the state. And the state is independent from the government, except the political direction. So it is very important here when we're talking about the social contract, who will do it? Will it be the government? What's the role of the state? Or is the nation coming into play on this one? The second thing is, and this is very interesting, in Greece we had full democracy in the mid-19th century together with Argentina. And we ended up with dictatorships after the Second World War. Then we have full democracies, and under full democracies, Argentina in 2001 and Greece in 2010 bankrupted the state. So the relationship between government and state, economics and politics, democracy and economic prosperity is not that clear. And this will have to be taken into account. The other thing is, what are your external priorities? The only thing I have to say here is about Mayotte. You know Mayotte? This one. Mayotte is an island in the Comoros cluster. And in 1970s, all islands voted to become independent, except Mayotte. Said, no, we want to stay with France. Since then, Comoros had I don't know how many military interventions, and today their per capita income is $900. Mayotte made the distinction to stay with a colonial master. I'm not recommending it, but I'm showing as a fact this one. Their per capita income in Mayotte is 11,000. And guess what? A very little known fact is that as many, proportionately, refugees that sink in the Mediterranean sink between Comoros and Mayotte, because destituted people, once they get to Mayotte, it's France. So it's like going to Italy, like going to Greece, like going to Germany. So the external kind of choices you have, you want to be with Iran, you want to be with Saudi, you want to be with France, you want to be with America, is very important. That then determines what other options you can have. The choice between growth or distribution is totally false. The two have to go together. You must have social justice when you do economic policy. This is the half-life of the circle, of the matrix, is a technical term. If I do these reforms, how long will it take for 50% of the results to show? For example, in my country, the IMF said, and the Greeks accepted, that by 2012 we'll be out of the crisis of the measures. Now it's 2016, we broke the Olympic records in terms of length of recession and depth. Why? Because we didn't estimate the half-life of the matrix. That is, how long will it take for the measures to work and come out of the crisis? So you need to do these things, and also to stop fighting ghosts. The public sector, as I mentioned before, the clinic and the public sector hospital, And you should stop praising chimeras, the private sector. The private sector makes money, and that's what it should do. But it needs a strong government to not just to privatize and denationalize, but to oversee the functions of the private section. And can we get the facts right? I think that's a very important one, to get the facts right, because you can see half of the presentations was a play between different ways that we assess the facts. And this is really the last slide, right? And these are challenges now for the MENA region. How to write a social contract during a period of recession. If it's growing, you can start distributing things left and right. If everybody's running for his life, things are pretty difficult. This definition of nationalism, Britain has it. We want to have independent policy and sovereignty. And what does it mean in a globalized world? Nobody does have that anymore. We are in an international and a globalized world. So the meaning of sovereignty is totally different than those who voted for Brexit thought that it is. How to manage the international agencies. I've been talking about the agencies I have worked, okay? We go with our agenda, World Bank, IMF, ILO, UNICEF, and the client, the country, sometimes is not too strong, even in my country, to correct the international agencies on what kind of policies are appropriate for the country. You remember the difference between international poverty line and national poverty lines. They go that way. And finally, I thought I should mention this, about the SC, as they mentioned, the social contract. In MENA, is part of inequality, Rami, that you asked me to discuss. The social contract in the Middle East is the most unequal in the whole world. And this is a decision that has to be addressed, in the sense that no matter whether women work or not, you have to feed them, right? So can you go in a globalizing world when half of the population does not work, or does not work as effectively as in other places? How can you compete in a country, with a country that 60–70% of women work, compared, say, in Lebanon, that only 20–25% of women work? Imagine if these women were work. I mean, Lebanon would have been in a much better position. That was really the last slide. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You gave us a lot of information and a lot of food for thought. So I will open it up for questions and comments. If you have a question or a comment, please identify yourself if you could, and try to keep them short so that we can have as many people asking as possible.
I think it was a very clear presentation.
Given that, let's take the example of Lebanon, which is also, in some sense, it's unique. It has some similarities, but it also has some uniqueness. But some of that is also applicable to other countries. Is it possible to think of the kind of, scenarios under non-ideal circumstances? Say, assume the corruption is there. You can say, okay, we need to, for efficient economy, we need to deal with corruption. But what if somebody says, let's assume corruption? Because since getting rid of corruption is so difficult. And think of what would be the tools to improve the economy and to achieve a level of services within corruption. Mm-hmm. So we take it as a given, like bad weather, or lack of water. Say, how do agriculture with this percentage of water? How can we do with a political situation that is not optimal at all, in some level? What would be the recipe under those non-optimal circumstances? Or should we always say, no, we have to end corruption because nothing works under corruption? You can apply, taking corruption as an example, you can apply other examples. Oil revenues, which can also have bad impacts on the economy. Authoritarian regimes. Is there a kind of approach where you can think of how can I do if I fix this as given and think of economic policies? under certain non-optimal conditions, such as corruption, authoritarianism, oil money. Is there an approach of that kind to the problems, rather than lump them all together and say, oh, we have all these problems, and we can't know where to start?
More questions or answer?
Answer maybe one.
Okay. No, this is a very valid point. It is everywhere. I mean, we found out about Panama, right? Even the father of Cameron in Britain, right, had some shares there. We don't know whether it was money laundering or whatever it was. And, but there was a lot of money laundering going there. There is the famous list Lagarde from Swiss banks, which has a list of names that they are digging down, and they are finding out whether Americans have deposits in the war. The Swiss banks help them. And in fact, Swiss banks paid a lot of billions of dollars in compensation to the tax authorities in the US, and they've changed now their procedures and policies with respect to confidentiality and disclosure. So corruption is always a problem. I will reply with two things. First, there is institutionalized corruption, and there is a kind of non-institutionalized corruption, that is corruption that we close our eyes. If it is institutionalized corruption, people say it may not be that bad. I give examples. I've worked in East Asia, and institutionalized, what we call corruption, is there. We were given from the World Bank a big project to Indonesia. 10% was the signature of the minister. So it was 100 million. It became 90, right? 5% was the DG, the Director General of the Ministry. Then it went to the province. It was 3% there, right? It went down to the policemen who were doing the like and the other local authorities. And we know the 100 million was 80, but the 80 you could find. You go to Latin America, I don't want to mention Lebanon, you go to Latin or Jordan. You go to Latin America and you give, 100 million for schools, and you go for supervision, the money has been consumed, and where is the school? It is not there. Why? In Latin America, if I see you as an official, you took a penny, there is a law there, and you go to prison. This law was not there in Indonesia. So this is a very difficult question. How far do you go towards this tolerance, if you want, or how many gaps you have in your legal system that enables the high-level officials to do this kind of corruption vis-à-vis the low-level kind of corruption. And this is the second part. Are we talking about high-level corruption? Or I was in Tanzania recently. I should mention the name, but anyway, every that many kilometers, a policeman is there and stops your car, right? And comes and asks questions, right? And if you give him $1, right, he lets you go. And this is it's regular, right? So you know that when you start here and you finish there, you have to have another $10 the way you pay a toll, right? That's okay somehow, that makes you work. But if it is random and it is extortion, at that point it becomes unproductive corruption. What they say is the corruption is the oil that greases the wheel, right? So, and there is a joke here, if I can take a minute on that one, is supposedly the Greek Prime Minister visited Portugal, and the house of the Prime Minister was phenomenal. And he said, but look, you are a European Prime Minister, where do you find all this money? And the Prime Minister in Portugal opens the window and says, you see that bridge over there? That's 500 million. 250 million is here. In the reciprocity, when the Portuguese come to Greece, and the Greek one had golden handles and everything and the like, he says, okay, you know how I do it. What about you? The Greek Prime Minister opens the window and says, you see that bridge there? And the Prime Minister of Portugal says, no, 500 million is here.
Hi, my name is Rada. I work at Pakistan. I'm wondering, in terms of the social contract, the concept, I think the difficulty is you have to assume a certain level of trust between the people, the citizens, and the government. And the issue in the Middle East is it's not that the governments are not meeting the expectations of the people. At least in this stage, I think that people don't expect anything from the government. And so I mean, maybe with taking the unique problem of the Middle East, how does the World Bank, how do international donors re-strategize to improve the trust of the people in their government? Or is it, I mean, the way your thesis is like, there's a mix of, we need to have a strong public sector, but, there are outdated economic models that need to be changed. But I feel like there's a deeper question in there.
This is another of the list of questions I had before. I can add these two actually. But on the issue of trust, think what happened in Europe, not only my country. I was talking to an ambassador, and he told me, I'm totally devastated. I'm 62, about to retire, and all my life I planned it on the assumption I will have 3,000 euros a month as pension. Now we'll have 1,300. So how do there's nothing I can do. If I were young, I can start saving and the like. The worst thing, Cyprus. Usually we're talking about bailout. When somebody comes and bails you out from a difficult situation, an external factor. What did they do in Cyprus? In the banks. They had the crisis, and they said, whatever deposits that are here, will bail in. That is, we'll take them from the deposits. This is absolute theft. Assume I give you my car, because I go away for a month or two to take care of it, and by the time I come back, you tell me, no, you don't have a car, right, because I needed it. Or I'm a squatter and I take your house. And this was official. So you see at this point we've reached in this globalization game that the trust has disappeared in all aspects of public life. Of course, I mean, having a benchmark before, you can go back in Cyprus or in Europe, but this is one of the most difficult things. If you know the joke, who will put the collar around the neck of the cat so that the bell rings and she cannot catch the mice, right? So these are fundamental questions, and that's why when we give advice, and the governance should be the half-life of the matrix, what measures we take, how do we prioritize them, and how we go, and you can see, I mean, there are countries, for example, Morocco. Very slowly, Morocco has become, in my view, one of the best Arab countries, probably the best. They produce airplanes and cars and manufacturing, they have stability, and you cannot say it's the most kind of advanced politically or otherwise, but the little steps they've been taken. Jordan is another country, although perhaps dynamically it's not so stable. But you see Jordan with little by little, and surprisingly somehow, not surprisingly, coincidentally, if that's the case, Morocco and Jordan have monarchies. I think monarchies can play a stabilizing role. Why? Because you have a continuity, at least at that level, you have a reference point. I think in Jordan, if the king goes, it will blow up. Everybody knows if the royalty, the monarchy disappears in Jordan, things will explode, which you don't have it in Egypt, for example. The president can change. It can change in Algeria or in Syria, but in monarchies, if the head of state goes, everybody knows that everything will go haywire. And we had this problem in Europe. Greece 1974, Portugal, Spain 1975, we came out of dictatorships. Unbelievably, the Spanish reinstated the monarchy, right? The only phenomenon in modern history when monarchy is not abolished but is reinstated. And Spain has had the best kind of most continuous growth, including the fact that the daughter of the king and her husband have been indicted before a court, which has never happened in Portugal and Greece. I mean, for the presidents. Yeah.
On this point, if I can interject, I don't think the fact that the monarchy will not go, the fact that the legitimacy for the monarchy is more articulated than legitimacy for authoritarian republicans. The king does not have to justify. The legitimacy for the king is clear. If you want to stay in power as a president, you have to fake legitimacy by fake elections or by abolishing elections. The king's legitimacy is more secure in that sense, and that gives the power some kind of stability. So you don't have to. Oh, by chance, my son was elected. It happened to be the most popular person as well after me. For a king, doesn't have to fake that. And this requires more oppression. to fake legitimacy requires
Right.
even more oppression than the case of the kingdom.
But in the case, for example, of Europe, I mean, the Greek president or parliament is fully legitimate. Nobody challenges that. And you can see, I mean, what they have done to the economy and what has Cyprus is the other case. The bail-in, for me, the bail-in was the end of belief in modern economics somehow. Anything can happen. I mean, it's theft. You put your money, take them and keep them under your mattress. I mean, which is a disaster for the economy because there's no money to go around in credit. But the bail-in in Cyprus, it was state theft. And I used to tell my students that in all kinds of, not crimes, of actions are sanctioned in all societies under the name of the state. And society is tolerated. You can execute, you can torture, you can do anything. No society officially, at least in my time, has sanctioned theft. You cannot have a society if you have theft, because you take it from me, so why should I produce, right? Up until the Cyprus bail-in, there was no official theft. There was unofficial, there was corruption, whatever it is. But now we have official theft, which has to do with trust and all the things we say.
Before I make my questions or rants, I don't know what they are. I apologize maybe for my naiveness when it comes to the economic core of all the policies that we talked about today. But my question is that in the Middle East, as you mentioned, we have been applying economic policies to improve the living standards of, let's say, the poor, where we have a reduction in the middle class and an increase in the profit of the higher class, and at the same time we have privatization and this denationalization of many industries, making it harder for this disappearing middle class and the rising poor class to make it into the economy, as you were mentioning. Shouldn't this raise the question about how are we making our policies and if our policies are efficient enough? Because this is not a pattern only in the Middle East, as you mentioned. It is also in Latin America, in Africa, etc., etc. So when we think about working on the poor class, are we really doing so, or are we just enriching the top? The second question is on, or that maybe, on globalization and about nationalism. So yes, of course, we cannot operate under as a unit, as they are thinking they will do in the UK. But can we not operate as a small group of countries? How doesn't protectionism to a certain extent improve our society and our economy? And this is something that it happened, and they tried to make it in Latin America with Venezuela and Mercosur. Shouldn't be this the next step when we're seeing that global economy and the global politics is failing to adapt to national policies, as you were mentioning?
I think that's well a successful model.
No, it's not a successful model, but I am saying that globalization proved in Latin America in the 80s, 90s, and now in the 2000s that they haven't doing very well at all. The national privatization in Bolivia, privatization in Argentina, etc., etc., etc. It's not about being one country, it's about being a small bloc rather than all the planet trying to get involved in the national policies.
Yeah, I mean, two questions here. The policies that we have for the poor. They didn't have policies for the poor effectively. I mean, by removing the public education, the public health since the 1990s, it was not policies for the poor. What we were doing, I mean, the international, I'm still talking as if I am at the World Bank. We were monitoring the absolute poverty, which after a point, we realized it has an indication for starvation and basic services, for UNICEF if you want, and humanitarian aid, but not for development. And the biggest challenge of all the international organizations is not how to deal with the poor countries, the least developed countries, like in Africa and Tanzania. With high-income countries, they do not deal because these have advanced capital markets and policy makers and the like. The biggest challenge for the IMF, for the World Bank and these organizations is what to do with the middle-income countries. Okay? So yes, there were no policies in the Middle East for the poor. We were monitoring the absolute poverty, which is not relevant, because there's no absolute poverty. You don't find the starvation you find in India, in Lebanon, right, or in Jordan. You don't see this abject poverty. So, and in this respect, first we had bad economics, And at the same time, what do you do? I mean, how can you do good economics when you have bad governments? That's why I said at the end it was not just bad economics or bad politics, it was bad economics and bad politics. Solutions depend on whether you have a leader. The geopolitics are very important. Mayotte, you remember Mayotte I mentioned? Let me give you another example. They say in Lebanon, you are all these 17 confessions, and we are divided between whatever it is, the north, the south, I mean, Iran, Saudi, Sunni, Shiite, and the like. And I've seen it again and again and again. Belgium is like that, okay? I mean, go to the Flemish side and speak French and see whether anybody replies to you until they realize that you are not from Belgium. If you are a foreigner, they reply to you in French. But if you are a Belgian and you talk to them in French, they don't reply to you. So let me give you an example. 1974 Greece. For 150 years since independence, we were worse than Lebanon, with Turkish occupation, with coup d'etat, dictatorship, civil wars, and everything. And it had no ending until 1974. What happened in 1974? We joined the European Union. So we stopped being this loose end in this East-West race that was happening, the NATO versus Warsaw Pact and the communists versus the Democrats. So at that point, we became a part of the European Union. So the Americans could not do a coup d'etat anymore. The Russians went to Prague, the Americans did a coup d'etat in Greece. But that stopped. So if some reason Lebanon could join the European Union, right, I think they will be better off. I mean, you can see that in the Baltic countries, and Belarus compared to Lithuania. Ukraine is a mess now, but geopolitics play a big role, and also level of income plays a big role. We've done studies, and above the level of $5,000 per capita income, it's too expensive for the fractions to start killing each other. So you can have it in Rwanda, you can have it in Congo, you can have it in Sudan, but once you pass the $5,000, you already have a house, you have a school, you have a job. So no matter how much you hear, the Belgium case, right? When they reach a level, all this slaughtering that was going between the Catholics and the Protestants became secondary, right? So I think Lebanon is helped by this fact. Of course, it can be a regional factor that will create something, but hopefully, I mean, it will be, one will not go back to that. But these divisions are there as long as there is no economic prosperity. You remember one of the questions I said, how can you do policy when you are in a recession, which now I can extend and say, how can you do policy if you are poor? In Africa, you lose nothing, and if you don't kill your neighbor, the neighbors will come to you. But here, the situation is much more complicated once incomes are relatively higher.
Thank you. My name is Issam. I'm afraid I still consult with international agencies that are too formal and ignore the informal, local, etc., and I'm sorry about that. But, and I'm also sorry that I joined you a little late. I can manage it otherwise. My point is, among the questions, the concluding questions that you posed, I missed seeing something about education and how education can actually change or bypass the millennia-long sexual contract, help develop a new social contract, etc., etc. You may have addressed this issue, but I think it's very much worth emphasizing.
No, this is an important question, and even if it's not an important question, it's very important because everywhere you go, everybody talks about education and skill shortages, if you want, and the mismatch between what the students study and what the labor market wants. I mentioned a little bit the Egyptian case in the 60s and 70s, where everybody will get a degree to go to the public sector, just for that reason, rather than for having skills and being useful to the private sector. There are a couple of things here. One is, perhaps you know Ishaq Diwan, and he has published a paper on how education has been used to manipulate the thinking of the young people, which is true to some extent for all countries. In fact, there was an interesting article in Britain. The reason that the Brexit prevailed was because the education system is not good, which is true to some extent. People didn't know what they were voting. It was a protest vote against the government, while the issue, it was not a protest vote. It was whether you stay in the European Union, right? That was one thing. On the economic side, and we have done some papers also for the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies with Dr. Mary Kawar. The argument here is from the data. Here I only concentrated on the inequality aspect because this was the theme. So there is an effect coming in because of the inequality. Now, Britain had for many, many years an inequality issue in education. For example, Scotland had 5 universities when England, being an imperial power, had only 2. And it was Cambridge and Oxford, and both were religious, right? And they had phenomenal inequality in education, phenomenally elitist, until the Robin Report in 1965, when they opened up and they created 45 universities. Now they have 160, if you believe it. But this did not prevent them from meeting the market requirements and employment needs. For the Middle East, my thesis is the following, that the young Arabs are over-educated, which is the opposite of what everybody else is saying. Now, why do I say that? I say that because I didn't go into this. The Arab production techniques are very backward. Why? Because you have chronic capitalism and the companies are not under pressure to modernize. Therefore, they can make do with very basic skills. So here we have example of Lebanon, what they say, a third or half of the generation of graduates emigrate, right? There are no jobs to make use of them. What are the objective indicators? First, we have high unemployment rate of educated people. So the employer can always hire an educated person for the price of an uneducated one, which has happened everywhere. When they say in New York, I mean, the taxi drivers are graduates, or in all countries. I mean, you go to the banks. In my time in the banks, there were middle school graduates. The teller does not have to have a degree. I go to Blom Bank where I deal with, and all the kids there, all the employees are graduates from Saint Joseph and AUB and LAU, and they are paid less than 1,000, right? So there is no shortage of skills. They are unemployed. The wages are low. If you don't find what you want as an employer, what you do, you increase the wages. And third, and this is very important, the Arab region has the highest skilled immigration rate in the world. The Arabs go to France, to Australia, to England, to Canada, to the US, and they are very productive. But they are not productive in Tunisia. They are not productive in Lebanon, and they are paid $1,000. If the same person leaves Blom and goes to France, he will be paid $5,000, right? So the constraint is he cannot go there. But if he could, he would get that much. So there is no shortage of educated people given the state of the economy. And the state of the economy is very basic. They have the same problem par excellence in the Gulf. They say the Gulfi students and graduates do not work. Of course they do not work, because if you can have a Bangladeshi, a Pakistani, an Indian working for $200 and $300, you have 6 of them instead of paying a national 2,000, and you can get by that. Anyway, that said, the education quality, academic quality, in the Arab world is very low. My argument is that the production requirements are even lower. Because if you take the TIMSS, the PEARLS, and the PISA results, which are the international comparative tests on education, Hong Kong scores 600 or whatever, which is the maximum, and all the Arab countries are below the world average, all of them. So yes, in terms of academic achievement, the Arab education output is very low, but still it is higher than what it is needed locally.
Sorry, can I just make a very short comment? I think it's wonderful that you raised the issue of material conditions and the nature of the economy in the region. But I didn't really mean education, just any education. I meant quality education, and that is, as you would say quite rightly, is largely missing in our region. And this poses the question that I would like to see: how can we change the nature of the curricula, the philosophies behind education, in order to achieve change, real change? And how local must we go in order to achieve that change vis-à-vis central, which has been tried for so long, and it just repeats stuffing the children and adults, young adults, with the same notions that have clearly not produced any outcomes, any useful outcomes. That's what I meant.
It depends how you pose the question. It's chicken and egg somehow. The issue here is how we can improve the education so there are not skills mismatches or skills shortages. So when I come as an employer, entrepreneur, I can find whatever I want. I'll give you two examples here. When I first came to Lebanon, and I was in a number of committees and private firms and the like, and there was a company, big company, that wanted to make a strategic decision to come and settle. That was before 2006, right? And there was a lot of euphoria and companies coming here. So of course I put the case of the Lebanese, right? I mean, you have the best education output. And their conclusion was, look, everything else is against Lebanon in terms of stability, of transparency, and all this kind of stuff. We'll go to Dubai and we will import the Lebanese. The point here is that skills follow production. They do not, they are not available to satisfy production. Let me give you an example. Assume you have a factory in Lebanon and you use a lot of material, including oil, maybe paper or wood or whatever it is. Assume the price of one input goes up. Would you close the factory? No. You will pay more and you will pass the cost to others. Now, why you do not pay more your people if you have a shortage? And the salaries are very low in Lebanon, which means there is no shortage. Otherwise, if I had to compete, I will pay more and more and more. But salaries are stagnant in Lebanon, which means that the supply of skills is more than adequate, and that's why the supply of skills goes abroad. So it is production that drives the skills, rather than skills that improve production. And it's a dynamic game. I remember I was already, a mature, tenured university lecturer in the 1980s, and my graduate in IT, because they had to take economics, he will leave the university and his salary was double mine. And I was 10 years older than him, right? And I was very much better in education. And then we had a blip with the accountants, with the deregulation of the financial markets. And those who were doing economics and accounting or financial economics, they will be 21 years old and they will graduate and they will get much more than me. Now, you look 5 years down the road and there was no this premium anymore. Why? Because the wages were so high, there was more demand for these courses, economics department were going down, and we were doing service teaching, as we all know, and the accounting and IT and others, financial, were expanding, and the market, after a blip, came back to normal. So the way the thing works is that there is prices, and prices adjust. They create incentives for more education if there is a shortage.
I promise this will be my last sentence.
Always pleasure. Yeah.
You raised the issue of chicken and egg, and I claim that the issue has to be resolved by looking at evolution. Certain evolutionary conditions existed that favored animals that laid eggs rather than. So the question must be, how can we create a set of conditions, economic conditions, that will help the evolution of a better education system? I know this is rather convoluted, but I'm sure I'm.
No, that's very legitimate. At the end, the how-to is more important than what to do. We know what to do, but how do you do it if you have corruption, if you don't have trust, if you have all these things that are happening all over the place. But since you mentioned evolution, that was one of the things I started with.
Sorry, yeah, somebody else wants to. But look, I mean, it seems to me, and this should not take as criticism, is that we don't have a model yet. I mean, so complicated. If you add to it the failure in Greece with democracy and stability and part of Europe, you add some authoritarian regimes were quell in China and other places. Some places will have a really deep poverty, are stable and democratic, like in India, and then you look at neoliberal theories. They have failed, but so are the other nationalization ones, even failed worse. Venezuela is much worse than any other place now on the face of the earth in terms economically. Is there a real new social government? Not the new, which looks like the old, which already has failed in the past and is failing now. I mean, is there really, is the conclusion that we have no clue? Mm-hmm. Is that the conclusion? That we have questions?
It's partially articulated.
But you know that these things don't work, given how complicated the systems are. Is there the questions that we are basically don't have a model for how to get these places off the ground?
Can I just add to that same idea? We have countries like South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, maybe some in South America, who were able to achieve growth with equity, with social services and a safety net. So other people have made the transition that from autocracy and poverty to prosperity and equity. So we can do it, presumably, so it's done, it's doable. Where do you think what's the magic formula to bring about this change?
The issue is how to do it.
I'll
come to both points, but the issue here is, do we know, what we are doing? The answer is not really. For example, globalization. We didn't know what globalization was in 1990 and how it would impact both on political and economic regimes. I don't think you were when Piketty was here, and I was discussing it. And I started with a quotation from my textbook. Right? When you write a textbook in your career, you represent, what is known, and it's legitimate then. And I picked The Economist because there is Grey's Anatomy. You've seen Grey's Anatomy, the book. It's 150 years old. Nothing has changed there, right? The guy wrote the bones and the arteries and the valves and everything. It's the same thing. My textbook was 1991, and I quoted a very great economist, bigger than Piketty so far, and he's young and he will catch up and perhaps he will exceed, Keynes, who said that the most stable relationship and the most surprising is the share of wages in GDP, right? And you saw in my presentation, since globalization, the GDP, the share of wages has been declining, which I would have defended it to death that it will continue to be like that in 1990. Why? Because at the end of the day, economy is not there for the sake of the economy. Economy is for the sake of people. So what does it serve to have economic growth and development and more money if it doesn't go back to the people? It looked to me as a natural law. The more you produce, the more the workers and the citizens, especially the democracy, they get more and more and more. So this changed, and we don't know how to handle it. The big problem we have is that people are local, and governance is no longer local. It doesn't depend what you do locally, but you are part of a world that is moving. Even if you do well, it doesn't matter. What matters is how much better you do compared to the others. Now we come to Korea, Malaysia to a lesser extent, and what happened in East Asia was they had a state-led industrialization, which at the time everybody was believing, even the right and the left, but gradually they managed to get a position in the international economy through exports. How much you produce and income you have does not depend on how much the Lebanese buy. If you convince others to buy, then suddenly Lebanon becomes a rich country. So they were at a point in time when the world was expanding, it was not globalized, the industry and technology was improving, and they found themselves also under the right level of governance, and none of them had democracy, right? Singapore. But what they did a number of things. For example, they said foreign investors can come as long as they produce here. It's enough. People will find a job. In Greece today, the privatization has not moved at all. Oh, why should we sell the ports to the Chinese? Come on, I mean, take the money and the port remains in Greece. Why don't you sell it and get the money? So they are the lessons of how they did it. There was a little bit of a specific point in time that you cannot do it anymore. I mean, you cannot produce T-shirts anymore or cheap manufacturing goods because China is there. So the strategies are totally different and more refined. I told you the big challenge of IFIs today is what to do with the middle-income countries, right? And these countries were poor, became middle, and they grew, but not anymore. You cannot follow this kind of linear movement towards development.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking you.
You helped me double the questions in the last slide, eh? I will add them. Yeah. Thanks very much for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.